It was a Tuesday evening when the letter arrived, a cold, drizzling twilight that crept in through the city streets. I had just returned to my tiny, third-floor apartment, the smell of damp concrete still clinging to my coat. As I fumbled with my keys, I noticed the envelope lying on the floor by the door, just inside the threshold. It hadn't been there that morning. The envelope was ancient-looking, the paper brittle and yellowed like parchment. My name, Ethan Graves, was written across the front in looping, elegant script, far too formal to belong to anyone I knew. There was no return address, only a single postmark, February 3, 1897. I frowned, turning the envelope over in my hands. It was sealed with a blob of crimson wax pressed into a crest, a pair of crossed keys encircled by thorny vines. A chill prickled the back of my neck. Curiosity gnawed at me, but as I broke the seal and unfolded the paper inside, the world seemed to shift. The dim lighting of my hallway flickered for just a second, and a faint hum filled my ears, as if the air itself were vibrating. The letter was handwritten in the same flowing script as the address, every stroke deliberate and precise. My eyes darted to the opening line. Ethan Graves, you must read this carefully, for it may save your life, or seal your fate. The chill deepened. I read on. I know this will seem impossible, but I have written this letter knowing it would reach you on this exact day. You are in grave danger. On February 10th, precisely 1 week from now, your life will end under the most horrifying circumstances. You cannot prevent this entirely, but there are steps you can take to delay it and uncover the truth. I blinked, my breath hitching. A joke. It had to be some elaborate joke. But as I traced the ink with my fingers, I could feel its permanence, its authenticity. This wasn't some printout or staged prank. The letter continued. The danger you face is tied to a curse placed upon your family generations ago. The nature of this curse is complex, but suffice it to say that every second you spend dismissing this warning brings the inevitable closer. You must not, under any circumstances, ignore the signs that will begin to appear in the coming days. Should you choose to heed this warning, you must first follow these instructions. The handwriting shifted slightly, the pen strokes more hurried, as if whoever wrote it had grown frantic. Do not trust your reflections. Avoid unfamiliar shadows. And whatever happens, do not enter room 313 of the Falloway Hotel. I stopped reading, my pulse hammering in my ears. Falloway Hotel. That name sounded vaguely familiar, but I couldn't place it. I glanced around my apartment as if expecting someone to burst in and laugh at my confusion, but the room remained silent save for the faint patter of rain against the window. The letter wasn't signed. It ended abruptly, the bottom of the page stained with what looked like a splash of water, or perhaps a tear. For a moment, I stood frozen, my mind racing through possibilities. Had someone gone to absurd lengths to scare me? A friend, a coworker? Or was this some kind of targeted scam, though for what purpose I couldn't guess? I wanted to toss the letter aside, crumple it into a ball, and forget it had ever arrived. But instead, I found myself staring at the postmark again. February 3, 1897. Over a century ago. That couldn't be real. And yet, my hands were trembling. I shoved the letter back into the envelope and dropped it onto the counter, forcing myself to take deep breaths. Tomorrow, I decided, I'd bring it to someone, maybe a historian or a handwriting expert, just to prove how ridiculous this was. But as I turned to prepare dinner, something caught my eye. The mirror hanging above my mantel, faintly clouded with dust, reflected the room behind me. Except, in the dim light, there was a figure standing just over my shoulder. I spun around. Nothing. The apartment was empty. I glanced back at the mirror, and the reflection showed only me, wide-eyed and pale, clutching the edge of the countertop. A cold knot of dread settled in my stomach. The letter warned me not to trust reflections. And now, I wasn't sure if the danger was real, or if I'd just let it in. The night passed in a haze of restless anxiety. Every sound, every flicker of light, seemed sharper, more pronounced. I told myself I was imagining things, the letter had gotten under my skin, and the figure in the mirror was just a trick of the shadows. But the unease lingered. By morning, I was desperate for answers. I tucked the letter into a folder, determined to debunk this madness, and headed to work. My office was a nondescript cubicle in a sea of other nondescript cubicles at an insurance firm downtown. I had always hated the place, but today, its bland predictability was a welcome refuge. For a few hours, I managed to bury myself in spreadsheets and emails, convincing myself that everything was normal. Then my phone buzzed. Unknown caller. I hesitated, my finger hovering over the screen. Against my better judgment, I answered. Hello. For a moment, there was silence. Then a voice, low, gravelly, and cold, spoke. You've read the letter. My breath caught. Who is this? That's not important. What matters is what you do next. The warning is real, Ethan. You're running out of time. Is this some kind of joke? I snapped, trying to sound braver than I felt. Who put you up to this? The line went dead. I stared at the phone, my heart pounding. I was tempted to dismiss it as another prank, but something about the voice, the sheer weight of its certainty, left me shaken. I took the rest of the day off and headed to the library, hoping to distract myself with research. The Falloway Hotel. That name had been nagging at me since I read the letter, and I needed to know why. The library's archives were quiet and dimly lit, the scent of aged paper hanging in the air. I scanned the database until the name appeared, Falloway Hotel, 1873 to 1912. It had been a luxury hotel in its prime, but a fire in 1912 gutted the building, killing several guests and staff. The tragedy had left the property abandoned ever since. A shiver ran down my spine as I scrolled through the photographs of the charred remains. The building's skeletal frame was haunting, its once grand facade now a crumbling ruin. But it wasn't just the fire that caught my attention, it was the rumors that followed. Multiple accounts described strange occurrences in the hotel before the fire, guests vanishing without a trace, whispers in empty hallways, mirrors that didn't reflect reality. And room 313 had been the epicenter of it all. One article described it as a room of shadows, where guests claimed to hear voices calling their names and see figures watching them in the dark. After a particularly gruesome incident, a man reportedly throwing himself from the room's window in a fit of madness, the hotel had sealed the door and refused to rent it out again. I leaned back in my chair, my skin crawling. The Falloway Hotel was a ghost story, a relic of urban legend. And yet, the letter's warning was now etched into my brain, do not enter room 313. But why me? What connection did I have to any of this? I packed up my things and left, the weight of unanswered questions pressing down on me. As I walked home, the streets felt unusually quiet, the city's usual bustle muted. I chalked it up to my fraying nerves, but then I noticed the shadows. They moved. At first, it was subtle, an extra ripple where there shouldn't have been one, a flicker in the corner of my vision. But as I crossed the intersection near my apartment, the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long, curling toward me like reaching hands. I froze, my breath puffing in the cold air. The dim streetlights flickered overhead, and for a moment, the shadows around me deepened, growing darker, thicker, as if alive. And then they snapped back to normal. I stumbled into my apartment and slammed the door, my hands trembling. My reflection in the mirror above the mantel caught my eye again, and this time, I didn't look away. I stepped closer, scrutinizing every detail. My reflection stared back, perfectly ordinary, except for the faintest hint of movement in its eyes, as if it blinked just a fraction too late. I grabbed a towel and draped it over the mirror, my chest tight with panic. That night, I didn't sleep. The letter had warned me of signs to come, and now I couldn't deny they were happening. Shadows, reflections, voices on the phone, all of it felt like the pieces of a puzzle I didn't want to solve. But the most chilling realization was this. Today was February 4th. And February 10th was only 6 days away. The next morning, I decided to visit the ruins of the Falloway Hotel. It felt reckless, but the letter's mention of room 313 haunted me. If there was any chance this was all connected, I needed to see the place for myself. The hotel was on the outskirts of the city, in a part of town long abandoned to decay. As I approached, the remains of the building loomed through the fog, a crumbling husk of blackened stone and shattered windows. The front gate was chained shut, a faded, "No trespassing" sign dangling crookedly. Ignoring the warning, I climbed over the rusted fence, landing on the cracked pavement inside. The air was heavy with damp and rot, the faint scent of burnt wood still lingering after more than a century. The entrance was sealed, but one of the side walls had collapsed, leaving a jagged opening. As I stepped through, I felt a strange pull, as if something in the building was beckoning me deeper. Inside, the charred remains of furniture and broken chandeliers lay scattered across the floor. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the soft creak of the ruined structure settling. I took a cautious step forward, the sound of my footfall echoing unnaturally. My flashlight beam swept across peeling wallpaper and faded murals, the once luxurious interior reduced to ash and rubble. I had no idea where room 313 might have been, but I felt compelled to climb the grand staircase ahead, its steps warped and brittle. Each creak of the wood sent a jolt of unease through me. The second floor was even darker, the ceiling partially caved in. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a figure at the end of the hallway, a silhouette, tall and still, standing in the shadows. "Hello?" I called, my voice cracking. No response. The figure didn't move, but as my flashlight steadied, it was gone, leaving only an empty corridor. I pressed on, my pulse hammering. The hallway seemed endless, the numbers on the doors faded and barely legible. At last, I found one marked 313, the number etched deeply into the wood as if it had been carved in a fit of rage. The door was slightly ajar, its hinges rusted. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but I couldn't. I pushed the door open, the sound of groaning metal cutting through the silence. The room was nearly empty, save for a shattered bed frame and a broken mirror leaning against the far wall. The air felt colder here, and as I stepped inside, my breath came out in visible puffs. And then I saw it. A single piece of paper lay in the center of the room, untouched by time or decay. My heart sank as I recognized the handwriting. It was identical to the letter I had received. I knelt down and picked it up, my hands trembling. "Ethan. You were warned not to come here. But I knew you would. Curiosity is your greatest flaw, and now you have brought yourself closer to the end. Room 313 is a doorway, not just a room. By entering, you have invited its watchers into your life. You will see them more clearly now, in reflections, in shadows, in the spaces where light and darkness meet. They will follow you, growing bolder with each passing day. There is no escape from what has been set in motion. Prepare yourself. And remember, the seventh day is when they come for you." The letter slipped from my hands, fluttering to the floor. I stumbled back, my flashlight casting erratic beams across the walls. The broken mirror caught my attention. In its jagged surface, I saw my reflection, or at least, I thought it was mine. But it wasn't moving. I froze, staring at the reflection as it stood perfectly still, its eyes locked on mine. Slowly, it smiled, a cold, twisted grin that didn't belong to me. A sound broke the silence behind me, a low, rasping whisper that sent chills racing down my spine. I spun around, the flashlight trembling in my grip. The room was empty, but the whisper grew louder, more insistent, filling my ears with words I couldn't understand. I bolted, tripping over debris as I fled the room. The hallway seemed to stretch impossibly long, the exit always just out of reach. The whispers followed, growing into a cacophony of voices, all calling my name. When I finally burst through the side opening and into the cold air outside, the noise stopped abruptly. The oppressive silence returned, broken only by my gasping breaths. I didn't look back as I scrambled over the fence and ran. It wasn't until I was safely locked inside my apartment that I realized the truth. The letter in room 313 wasn't just a warning, it was a death sentence. And now, there were only 5 days left until February 10th. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound outside my apartment felt amplified: footsteps in the hallway, the creak of the old radiator, the faint hum of distant traffic. It all merged into a relentless symphony of dread. The mirror above my mantel was still covered with the towel. I hadn't dared to uncover it, though I could feel its presence, like an open wound in the room. The letter from room 313 haunted me. I reread it over and over, hoping to find some hidden meaning or loophole. But its message was clear: I'd unleashed something. And now, it was coming for me. By the time dawn broke, I decided to do the one thing I'd been avoiding: I called my mother. She picked up after the second ring, her voice warm but cautious. "Ethan? Is everything okay?" "No," I admitted, my voice cracking. I think something's wrong. Something about our family. Did anyone ever mention a curse?" The line went silent for a moment. "Why would you ask that?" she said finally, her tone wary. "Because I found something, a letter. It says I'm in danger, and it mentions a family curse. Mom, please, if you know anything." She sighed heavily, the kind of sigh that carries years of secrets. "When you were young," she began, her voice low, "I wanted to tell you, but I thought it was better if you didn't know. There's a story your grandfather used to tell, about a deal our family made generations ago. He claimed that someone in the family had done something terrible, and the punishment was passed down. I always thought it was just folklore." "What kind of punishment?" He didn't know. "Just that every few generations, something terrible would happen. People would disappear, or accidents would happen. I don't know if I ever believed it, Ethan, but your grandfather was convinced. He kept a journal, but I haven't looked at it since he passed." "A journal?" I asked sharply. "Do you still have it?" "Yes," she said. "It's in the attic. I can bring it to you." "No. I'll come to you." I hung up, grabbed my coat, and left the apartment. I didn't trust staying in one place for too long anymore. An hour later, I arrived at my mother's house, a cozy little place in the suburbs that felt untouched by the chaos in my life. She greeted me at the door, concern etched across her face. "It's probably just nonsense," she said, leading me to the attic. "Your grandfather had a wild imagination." We found the journal in an old trunk, buried beneath layers of dust and forgotten keepsakes. The leather-bound book was worn, its edges frayed from years of handling. I flipped it open, the scent of aged paper filling the room. The entries were meticulous, written in tight, cramped handwriting. At first, it seemed like the ramblings of a paranoid mind, notes about omens, strange sightings, and cryptic warnings. But then I found an entry dated February 9, 1897. "It will happen tomorrow. The curse has chosen again, as it always does. I cannot stop it, only document it. The signs have been clear: shadows where there should be none, reflections that do not obey, whispers in the dark. And always, always the watcher. They come for him at dawn. God forgive me." Beneath the entry was a sketch, crude but unmistakable. It was the crest from the wax seal on the letter I'd received, crossed keys encircled by thorny vines. I stared at the page, my heart pounding. My family had known about this, lived through it, and done nothing to stop it. My mother touched my shoulder. "Ethan, what's going on? What aren't you telling me?" I hesitated, the weight of everything crushing down on me. I think. I think I'm next. On the way back to my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The shadows seemed darker again, stretching unnaturally in the evening light. The reflections in shop windows seemed to linger a moment too long, like they were studying me. When I reached my building, the hallway lights flickered as I climbed the stairs. My hand trembled as I unlocked my door, and as I stepped inside, the air felt wrong. Colder. Stale. I froze when I saw the towel. It had fallen to the floor. The mirror above the mantel was uncovered, and my reflection stared back. At first, it seemed normal, me, disheveled and tired. But as I watched, the reflection began to change. Its expression twisted, the face contorting into something inhuman, eyes dark and hollow, mouth stretching into an impossibly wide grin. It raised a hand, but I hadn't moved. The reflection pointed directly at me, its fingers shaking with a violent intensity. And then it whispered, its voice crawling into my mind like 1,000 insects. 4 days. The mirror cracked, a spiderweb of fractures spreading across the glass. I stumbled backward, falling onto the floor as the air grew heavier, suffocating. The room seemed to pulse, the shadows writhing like living things. I crawled toward the door, my breath shallow, and fled into the night. The streets offered no solace. Every window, every reflective surface, showed glimpses of the figure now following me. 4 days. I didn't know how to survive them, or if I even could. The city had never felt so hostile. Everywhere I went, I felt eyes on me, unblinking, silent, waiting. The reflections in puddles and windows shifted unnaturally, shapes darting just out of sight. Even the air seemed heavier, pressing down on me with an oppressive weight. By the time I made it back to my apartment, I was exhausted, my nerves frayed. My hands shook as I locked the door behind me, turning every latch, every deadbolt, as if it would make a difference. The cracked mirror above the mantel caught my eye, its fractured surface distorting the room into chaotic fragments. I couldn't bring myself to cover it again. Some morbid part of me wanted to see, to confront whatever was lurking in the shadows. I sat on the couch, the journal my mother had given me open on my lap. There had to be something I'd missed, some clue about what this curse was and how to stop it. Most of the entries were vague, cryptic ramblings about the Watcher and the seventh day. But one passage stood out, dated years after the February 9th entry. The curse thrives on fear. It twists the mind, ensnares the senses. The more you fight it, the tighter its grip becomes. But to understand its nature, one must look to its source. The deal made long ago, sealed in blood, bound by shadow. A deal. My family had done this to themselves. The thought filled me with a cold fury. I didn't know who had made the deal or why, but it was clear that I was just the latest pawn in a game played generations ago. I flipped the page, and my blood ran cold. It was another sketch, this one more detailed. It depicted a figure cloaked in darkness, its face obscured, holding the same crossed key crest from the letter. Below it was a single line of text. The seventh day is when the Watcher collects its debt. A knock at the door shattered the silence. I froze, my heart hammering. I wasn't expecting anyone, and at this hour, the thought of opening the door felt unthinkable. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. Ethan. The voice was familiar, but distorted, as if spoken through a broken radio. Ethan, let me in. I crept toward the door, every instinct screaming at me to stay quiet. My breath hitched as I peered through the peephole. No one was there. The hallway beyond was empty, bathed in the flickering glow of the overhead lights. And yet, the voice came again, closer now, as if it were right on the other side of the door. Ethan, you can't hide forever. I stumbled back, clutching the journal to my chest. The air grew colder, and the shadows in the room seemed to shift, pooling in the corners like black ink. Suddenly, the mirror above the mantel groaned, its fractured surface vibrating. I turned to face it, dread rooting me in place. The cracks in the glass began to glow faintly, pulsing with a sickly green light. My reflection stared back at me, but it wasn't moving in sync. Instead, it grinned, a wide, unnatural smile that sent shivers down my spine. The reflection leaned forward, its mouth opening impossibly wide. From within came the same distorted voice. 3 days, Ethan. You're running out of time. The glow from the mirror intensified, filling the room with a blinding light. I shielded my eyes, the journal slipping from my hands. And then it was gone. The light vanished, the room plunged into darkness. When I opened my eyes, the mirror was intact again, no cracks, no glow, nothing. Just my reflection, wide-eyed and trembling. But something was different. The journal was gone. I searched the room frantically, flipping over cushions and throwing open drawers, but it was nowhere to be found. The journal, the only thread connecting me to the truth, had been taken. I sank to the floor, my head in my hands. The walls felt like they were closing in, the weight of the curse pressing harder with every passing second. 3 days, I whispered to myself, the words hollow and meaningless. How could I fight something I didn't understand? How could I escape a fate that seemed inevitable? I had no answers. Only the growing certainty that whatever was coming for me wasn't human, and it was getting closer. The final 3 days were a blur of paranoia and desperation. Sleep became a distant memory, every moment haunted by flickering shadows and whispers that danced on the edge of my senses. My apartment felt alive, shifting and breathing with a malevolent will of its own. On the morning of February 10th, I woke to the sound of someone calling my name. Ethan. The voice was soft, almost soothing, but unmistakably wrong. It echoed through the apartment, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. I bolted upright, clutching the knife I had taken to keeping by my bedside. The room was bathed in a sickly gray light, the overcast sky outside casting faint shadows on the walls. Ethan, the voice called again, more insistent. I stood, my legs trembling, and crept toward the living room. The mirror above the mantel was glowing faintly, its surface rippling like water. I stopped in my tracks, gripping the knife tighter. 3 days, the reflection whispered. I blinked. It wasn't 3 days anymore. It was now. The reflection smiled, its face distorting into something monstrous. Its eyes were hollow voids, and its mouth stretched unnaturally wide, revealing rows of jagged, inhuman teeth. It's time, Ethan. The mirror shattered with a deafening crash, shards flying across the room. I ducked, shielding my face, but when I looked up, the room was dark. Completely, impossibly dark. I fumbled for my flashlight, but the beam barely pierced the blackness. The walls of my apartment were gone, replaced by an endless void that seemed to pulse with an unseen energy. And then I saw them. The Watchers. They emerged from the shadows, tall and gaunt, their faces featureless save for those empty, staring eyes. Their movements were slow, deliberate, as if savoring the moment. You can't run, one of them said, its voice a low growl that vibrated in my chest. My instincts screamed at me to flee, but my legs felt like lead. The air around me thickened, suffocating, as the Watchers closed in. No, I whispered, shaking my head. This isn't real. This can't be real. But it was. One of the Watchers raised a hand, its bony fingers outstretched, and the void seemed to twist and writhe around it. I stumbled back, tripping over something unseen, and fell to the ground. As the Watcher loomed over me, I caught a glimpse of its hand, holding something familiar. The journal. What do you want from me? I screamed, my voice cracking. The Watcher tilted its head, almost amused. A debt must be paid. Why me? I shouted, tears streaming down my face. I didn't do anything. I didn't make this deal. Blood binds the curse, it replied, its voice cold and unfeeling. You are the heir to its burden. The journal opened in its hand, pages flipping wildly, and the watchers began to chant, a guttural, alien sound that made my ears ache. I felt the ground beneath me shift, pulling me downward. My body grew heavier, the void swallowing me inch by inch. No! I cried, clawing at the darkness. Please, there has to be another way. The watchers didn't respond. But then, amidst the chaos, I remembered something from the journal: the curse thrives on fear. The more you fight it, the tighter its grip becomes. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to breathe. If fear was the key, then maybe, just maybe, I could deny it power. The void pulled harder, the watchers' chants growing louder. My body screamed in protest, but I refused to fight. Instead, I whispered to myself, "You're not real. You're just shadows." The pulling stopped. I opened my eyes, and the void wavered, the watchers pausing mid-chant. Their hollow eyes turned toward me, confused. "You're not real," I said louder, pushing myself to my feet. "You're not real, and you don't control me." The void trembled, cracks of light splitting through the darkness. The watchers recoiled, their forms flickering like dying flames. And then, with a deafening roar, the void shattered. I woke on the floor of my apartment, the morning light streaming through the window. The mirror above the mantel was gone, reduced to a pile of shards. The letter was lying beside me, its edges burned. When I unfolded it, the words had changed. "You broke the chain. The curse is severed. Live wisely, Ethan Graves. And remember, some debts remain unpaid." I didn't understand what it meant, but I didn't care. For the first time in days, the air felt normal, the shadows unmoving. The watchers were gone, and the overwhelming sense of dread had lifted. But as I stood, a faint sound caught my attention, a whisper, so quiet I almost didn't hear it. "Until next time." The mirror's shards trembled, just for a moment. I swept them into the trash and didn't look back.